it's Joe Pardavila, and you're listening to the Forbes Books podcast. And great leaders today are all striving to build an inclusive culture and improve team engagement. But you can't just take a class, read a book, or even listen to a podcast to be able to develop and execute a diversity and inclusion program. You need someone like today's guest. Stepping into the Forbes Book Studios in downtown Charleston is Arlene Roane, the founder and president of Redhouse Performance Consulting. For over 20 years, Arlene has been a trusted advisor to chief diversity officers, operational leaders, and HR talent professionals who have the desire to create a culture where people, regardless of their personal identity, can speak candidly, challenge respectfully, and build trust-based relationships. Arlene, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, I have a question. And actually, I have a series of questions. It's a podcast, so it makes sense that if I were to ask you more than one, right? Mm-hmm. So you've been in the diversity and inclusion space for quite a while, way before it was cool. What was it like working in that space before we became a little more enlightened in 2020? What was your work like, and how does it differ today?
I've been in this space for over 25 years, and initially it was really about why do some people leave? You know, I myself, Black female, I had a great career, and a couple of my friends did as well, and we all chose to leave those corporate careers for various reasons, and we were often asked the question, why did you leave? And I went to MIT, and so
that's a good school. I've heard of it. Yeah,
it's a small engineering school,
yeah.
And I like math and I like research. And I said that's the wrong question. The question we really need to understand is why do some people stay? So, and remember, this is before A Great Place to Work came out.
Yeah,
and we didn't even have that study. We didn't even have the war on talent from McKinsey, right? And so we started researching why do some people stay in organizations and what makes for a great career for them that doesn't reach across and translate well for people who might look different or be different. When we really started as researchers for organizations, researching what we now call human capital. Slowly but surely, more and more organizations became aware of and interested in the type of research that we were doing.
And I hate to be a capitalist pig about this, but you had to make money while you were doing this.
Oh, yeah.
And so to make money, you need to sell this proposition.
Right.
How difficult was it to sell this proposition 25 years ago before all of the aforementioned things that happened that improved our lives?
Sure. It wasn't a difficult sale for a small number of people.
Okay.
In particular, those organizations that had lost talent that they had invested in. I mean, this is back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so you had major companies like Bank of America and Procter & Gamble and some others who had invested heavily in recruiting people into those organizations, and then those people evaporated. And they said, hey, we're not going to go recruit more until we find out what happened to those who left. And so that was not a very difficult sell. Not at all.
But it was the other folks who didn't care.
It was the other folks. It was the other folks out there who hadn't yet experienced, that level of fall off, who hadn't made the investment. Those folks. It was also the folks who maybe started to engage in more global business, globalization of business. We saw that in the early 2000s in ways that were more significant than it had been in the 90s or the 80s. That's when we started to see global supply chains coming together. You were buying different pieces of your product. Even if you were a B2C kind of company, you were still buying different pieces of your product and your value chain from other countries. And so organizations had to become much more cognizant of how do I negotiate? How do I sit down and negotiate building a soap plant in China, right? Okay, we messed up. We lost a lot of money. We don't want to do that again. And so there was an element of the work that became, how do I better understand other cultures? And how do I navigate and negotiate within those cultural contexts?
Interesting. And, not to defend the mindset of people back in the 90s to 2000s, but if you think about it, that was a time where if people left, there were a list of people ready to jump in. This was before job hunters became job shoppers. So in a way, again, sorry, I'm not trying to defend them, but then they were like, oh, if X leaves, there's a list of Ys right behind them.
Exactly. And like I said, it was before the war on talent. McKinsey wrote The War on Talent. They did a huge research study. It came out, I believe, in 1998, 1999. And that was the first time that many corporate leaders first heard, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to have to fight for talent? You're kidding me. It's so easy to find.
Yeah.
And then sure enough, it did become true. By the early 2000s, 2004, 2005, the war on talent was a real thing. And it wasn't just the war for people who look like me. It was just war on great talent. How do I find the talent that I need with the skills that I need to drive my business forward? And it didn't matter if it looked like you, and I'm just going to look at you.
Yeah.
You look like a white guy to me.
Yep.
Or if it looked like me, and I'm a black female.
Yes. You're doing a great job of describing it for the audio audience. I appreciate that, Arlene. And also about the word war on talent. You mentioned that was written like late 90s, early 2000s. And you almost didn't even hear that phrase for years. And now all of a sudden, 2020 rolls around and you're hearing the quote unquote great resignation, war on talent. What's different now? Is the war the same in 2022 as it was in 2000? Or do you think there are some similarities to both?
Well, I think there are some similarities and there are some differences. Similarities, really attracting younger talent. And I'll be very specific. We need younger talent. Why? Because we need to have some of that younger talent mature into older talent within our organizations. Talent maturity is one way that we secure not only an economic advantage as a country or as a region or whatever, but a real advantage, a market advantage as a profit-driven organization. Or even I've worked with some global nonprofit organizations. How do we advance our mandate as a social justice organization? We need younger talent to mature into older talent. So we need that younger talent. So there is a war. We have to attract talent the way talent wants to be attracted. So that is a similarity.
Okay.
The differences are in the granular look, at what that talent wants and what that talent will tolerate. What I would tolerate coming out of school, when I came out of school years ago, is not the same what my children will tolerate coming out of their university programs. Just very, very different. Those are generational differences. And those generational differences are not going to change. There's going to be another generation that comes in another, 20 years. It's going to be, they're being born today, and then they're going to go into the workforce, and they're going to have things that they're not going to tolerate, that they're going to want to achieve for their life's purpose. So the devil's in the details. We can get the macro stuff right. We can get you here, but the details around what keeping you here is really going to be a challenge for most organizations. And that's where I do a lot of the more refined work, working inside an organization, trying to understand what is it that will keep talent here. Your best recruiting oftentimes is retention. People don't want to go to an organization that doesn't do a good job at keeping great talent engaged.
Yeah. And your best recruitment tool is usually your own employees.
That's
when your
it.
employees are going out there and say, "Hey, this is a great place to work. I don't know, I don't know what you're doing at your job, but my place, I'm happy when I come in. I'm looking forward to Monday," as they like to throw that around. And I'm wondering, we talked about what's changed from your early days in 2000 to 2020. What kind of changes have you seen since George Floyd's murder in May of 2020, which is crazy? So almost 2.5 years. It's amazing how time flies. But what kind of major changes are you seeing in the diversity space in the last couple of years when people sort of became a little more enlightened?
Right. Well, when I first started, it was about diversity. And diversity is nothing but the full range of human similarities and differences. Some of them observable, most of them not observable. We think we can see certain things about people, right? And that's why I always try to check. I said, observing, you appear to be a white male, but you could say, no. My pronouns are this and my background is this. And I say, okay, thank you for helping me. So there's diversity. So that's where we started. The focus of my work oftentimes, though, is around inclusion. Inclusion is the skill that makes diversity work. So
hang on, I'll stop you there, because I think to some people, diversity and inclusion are like they're the same thing.
Oh, they're not.
But they're not.
They're not.
Interesting.
Inclusion is a mindset. It's a set of behavioral characteristics.
Got it.
Am I open to, right? Am I willing to accept and navigate those differences that between myself and someone else?
Yeah.
That's inclusion. Another area that I work in is the skill of cultural competency. Can I really understand those less observable characteristics? how do those things that I used to describe myself, I'll use myself as an example,
Sure.
I'm a Black female, or sometimes I'll say African-American female over a certain age. We'll just leave it at that, over a certain age.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are the observable, but those have certain implications for how I see the world, how I navigate, how I interpret something as respect. I mean, you were telling me before we started this exchange that you had an experience walking with a female colleague through, let's just say, a major city.
Yeah.
And for the first time, as a male walking alongside of a female, you heard the cat calls and you heard, the footsteps behind her, stopping when she stopped. And so distinctly following her. And so, wow, a new experience for you. How do you navigate in that world? So you knew she was a female, but now you have greater insight into some of the hidden aspects of walking through the world as a female. So you might navigate with her very differently. That's a cultural competence skill. So yes, there's diversity, then there's inclusion. It's this behavioral attitude of acceptance, but then there's cultural competency. How do I walk beside someone who has a different reality? I don't like the term walk in someone else's shoes. It's impossible.
Yeah.
I can give you my shoes. That's great. You can walk in them, but you won't have the full expanse of my experience, right? But walking beside me, that's called allyship. And that's what we need. We need more allyship. So those are some of the differences that we've seen. And so since George Floyd, what we've seen more around the allyship, right? We will not all be George Floyd. I have sons that I've raised as Black men. I have stepsons who are white men. We will not all be George Floyd. And I hope that none of my sons are ever George Floyd or anyone in a scenario like that. But can we be an ally to those who have those experiences? Can we walk beside them, understand that they navigate the world very differently, and then make adjustments if adjustments are possible within the realm that we have control. Not all corporate organizations have control over that realm. And so we have to be very careful. Not all organizations can bring an upfront or ingest a social justice platform into what they do. But they can be mindful that social justice and equity, that's the other word that's been added to this equation. So we've gone from diversity to inclusion to maybe something that we would call equity, right? And now there's a phrase called idea, and they sort of they mix them around a little bit and we get idea. So we start with inclusion, right? Diversity, equity, and accessibility.
And what's the accessibility piece?
Accessibility says that we may have other challenges, maybe they're mobility challenges, maybe there's something physical about us, but do we allow that access? Do we allow access? It's an extension of equity in a more specific way. Are we allowing access in our organization such that people can live out their full potential?
Love that. And I'm wondering what your BS meter is like, because after 2020, you saw all these companies, you're laughing, throw up the Black Lives Matter on their websites, on the side of their buildings. And you're rolling your eyes at me right now as I'm doing this because you know where I'm going with this. It's great that they did that. Like on the surface, it's all surface. But what are they doing behind those banners and those graphics? Are they bringing in Black and brown people to run the company? So were you able to see some improvements in that?
I think we're seeing some improvements now.
Okay.
What I share with my clients and what I share with people when I'm asked that question is that identity and enthusiasm do not equal experience or change. So identity, meaning if I simply acquire people of a certain identity, and if those people or if I have a high level of enthusiasm, that does not equal experience. In the DEI space, I've seen a lot of people who are excellent, financial executives, or maybe they're excellent in operational management or whatever. And then all of a sudden they're the chief diversity officer. It's like, how did that happen? And while, yes, it is everybody's responsibility to be mindful of diversity, be an inclusive leader, and to navigate with cultural competence and all these other kinds of things and ensure that there's equitable access to opportunities in their organization, we're also required to be good financial stewards in the jobs that we have. But we don't commonly see someone from one functional area, let's say finance and accounting, show up as head of HR. We recognize that there is a functional expertise that is acquired over time. And so going back to that equation, identity plus enthusiasm do not equal experience or change. And so if you want experience or change, hire from experienced and changed experts in the field.
Wow. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, you almost painted, I come from the world of sketch comedy, and you painted like a sketch of like, hey, we need a D&I officer. All right, who's the black guy in the office? Who could we...
Exactly.
That's the way you describe it, and it's gross, but I'm sure it happens a lot.
It happens a lot. And unfortunately, it puts that person in a very difficult position, right? Who's going to say no, right? You're the black guy, or I'm the black woman, and say, hey, we want you to be the chief diversity officer. You're going to say, no, right?
Oh, my Lord.
Yeah. And so it puts that person in a very difficult position, and it puts the organization in a very difficult position.
Yeah, you joked a couple times about age, and you talk about bringing younger people in. And this is my opinion, and I don't know if a lot of people agree with me, but I think ageism is the last allowed ism in this world. You cannot make fun of someone's color, disability, or anything like that, but it's okay and completely acceptable to make fun of the old lady or the old guy, or not hire the old lady or old guy. Why is that still a thing? I feel like we're so much more evolved than that, but yet it's still this thing, and it's acceptable from almost every demographic, every skin color. It does not matter where you come from. It's okay to either fire an old person just because of their age or not hire them because of their age. Talk to me about that.
Absolutely. It is a very, and sometimes IDEA stands for ageism. Some people say not accessibility, but to remove age limitations. Some of it is just, I think some of it is just natural humanness.
Yeah.
We as humans tend to believe that when we reach early adulthood, we're at the peak, and then it's just downhill from there.
Right.
I mean, that's what we've experienced, for eons. It's no longer true to the extent that it was true 200 or 300 years ago, where life itself took a huge physical toll on us. And that physical toll, eventually took a toll on our emotional and intellectual abilities as well. And people died a lot earlier. We're living a lot longer. Not only are our bodies, sustaining a lot longer, but our mental acuity is sustained a lot longer. And so, we have to catch up to that. And you're right. I hear it all the time. There's always this element of surprise. For example, as a graduate of MIT, I work with some other MIT alums, and we help support and start the Hack for Inclusion at MIT. And sometimes when we go back and we do this, at the Sloan School, some of the students like, wow, you graduated in 1983 and you're doing the Hack for Inclusion and all this stuff. I was like, okay, Yeah. I mean, it's exciting for some, not all, right? It's exciting for many of us who are in maybe the third phase of our career or even beyond that to get engaged and hear the ideas and to contribute our own ideas to the conversation. So.
Yeah. And what's scary to me, I had this run-in with a gentleman I know, good friend. I've known him for years. Homosexual, white dude, super liberal. As woke as you can get. And we were having a conversation about hiring employees. And he goes, I'm looking for people in this position. He goes, oh, cool. Like, what are you looking for? He described it. And he goes out like this. He mentioned this. He goes, but I probably wouldn't hire anyone over 40 for that position. I'm like, well, why? Well, because once they're 40, here we go, predisposed. Once they're 40, they're set in their own ways, blah, blah, blah. And to me, I was like, my God, can you replace that I wouldn't hire a person 40 for anything else would be anywhere near acceptable or just like you just laugh at?
Yeah, most unfortunately, for many people, their only experience with someone, let's say over 40 or over 60, is in the context of a family. Basically, what he may be saying is that I wouldn't hire my father or I wouldn't hire my mother. And sometimes a little humor can be helpful. He's like, well, I wouldn't hire my mom either.
Right.
We just wouldn't get along. So let's put that aside. Or a more general way of saying is that, do you mean all people over 40 are not acceptable for this job, or just the people over 40 that you know?
Right.
So let's just get more specific about it, because the same used to be said. I remember when I went to MIT, the same used to be said, oh, girls just aren't good at this. Right. And luckily I had an advisor at the time who was pretty senior in the MIT administration. And he came with me, and I'm negotiating with this professor because I solved the problems the same way as my male counterparts. And in fact, I was like the group leader of the study group. And it was like they all got better grades than I did. And this professor said, well, girls have difficulty, especially girls like you. And we know what he meant. He meant black girls like you have difficulty with this. And I'll never forget, my advisor stepped in. His name is Constantine Semenides, and he said, do you mean all girls or just the girls you know? Because this girl is different.
Damn.
And I've carried that with me my whole life.
What year was that? What year do you remember?
That was 1979.
1979.
1979.
That's lifetimes ago, and that stayed with you.
It stayed with me. Mm-hmm.
Wow.
I still use it. Do you mean all girls, or do you mean all people from China? Do you mean all people from India, or just the few that you've met?
And it's amazing. I think if you were to peel the onion on you, that one moment in life sort of just fueled you to where you are today.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've been, you can say lucky, I say blessed, with having people in my path who just enlighten me and help me see the world. My mother used to say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Arlene, don't raise your hand first all the time. Don't blurt out the answer all the time. Behave like the other little girls, because it's the 60s.
Yeah.
She said, give yourself one time a day where you can, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. But then my father would come back and say, but the Romans know you're not one of them. Right?
That's funny. And we all kind of need that Constantine in our life. We can't do this all by ourselves.
We can't.
And that's what the role you're kind of filling now. You're taking Constantine's one little exchange you had with a professor, and that's fueled what you're doing today. And on your LinkedIn, you have this little line, and I want to say it in closing, is creating spaces where people believe they are valued and appreciated. Mm-hmm. All of those words are sort of lowercase, but believe is all uppercase. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about believe.
Well, that's what Constantine did for me. At that moment, I really believed I belonged at MIT. I went to MIT because my father went there. I understood that I had an imperative. I was named after my father, or the whole bit. So I'm going to follow in his footsteps and all that kind of stuff. But until that exchange, I didn't really believe that I belonged there. And in that statement, it changed everything for me. And if I can help people find that place where they can share their belief with someone else, sometimes, and that's what I do with leaders. If you really do believe this, how do you help others believe it? You can't just tell them, but how do you walk beside them as an ally? How do you transform the culture in your organization so that people, even those who may be different, believe that you value their contribution?
I love that. Thank you very much for sharing that. It's Arlene. My big thing is I'm always about learning about what other people are thinking, because I can never think what you're thinking, and obviously you're much brighter than I am. But I use this story a lot. So living down in the South, you're going to run into folks who may not have the same beliefs as you. And in my apartment complex, a couple of years ago where I was living, this guy was driving a big red truck, and it had the QAnon acronym splayed across the windshield. And me, as a card-carrying liberal from New York, would automatically go to, well, is this nut? What the heck's wrong with this guy? What a weirdo. But then I run into him at the pool, and it could not have been the nicest person in the world. We didn't talk about QAnon. We didn't talk about politics. We were just talking about family and barbecuing and all the stupid things people talk about when they're sitting around a pool. And I use that story a lot to folks to, even though we sometimes judge a book by its cover, sometimes it's a good idea to open that book and see what's inside of it. So thank you very much for sharing your story. Her name is Arlene Roane. Arlene, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. I appreciate being here today.
You're very welcome. To connect with and find out more about Arlene, go to redhousepc.com. And that wraps up another episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so you automatically get new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please, don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.